you. So whilst we're waiting for the slides to come up, perhaps I should just put in a couple of quick caveats to everybody. I was asked to talk about women's health through the life course and the issue of major demographic shifts. But so my first caveat is that I'm not actually a demographer, but I work more in the area of social and political sciences in relation to particularly gender and health. So I'm actually going to focus more on issues relating to women's health in a social and political context, both now and what we think is coming down the line. The other caveat is that I actually work predominantly on gender and health, but I'm going to do what I was asked to do and focus on women's health, but come back to the question of gender and health as I go through the slides. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this type of presentation of data on the burden of disease rather than the prevalence of disease. So this is data collected by the Global Burden of Disease in IHME in the University of Washington. And even if you're not a quantitative demographer or an epidemiologist, I hope you can see that between 1990 and 2020, there has been a significant epidemiological shift in the burden of diseases that women and girls across all ages suffer from. As Thomas has already pointed out, and as I know will be addressed by future speakers, there is a very significant shift from a predominant picture of infectious diseases and maternal ill health towards the burden of non-communicable diseases. As Thomas has pointed out, clearly this varies from country to country, from economic setting to economic setting, but the global picture is that we are seeing a kind of inexorable climb in the burden of non-communicable diseases, which is a huge group of conditions and diseases ranging from everything from mental ill health to long-term chronic conditions to, as you'll see in the next slide, please, the big killers of men and women, which includes things like ischemic heart disease, stroke, and cancers. I've presented this slide, which is to remind us that by focusing on women's health, it's kind of important, particularly in the context of UHC, to also remember that we need to be talking about and thinking about and focusing on the other 49% of the population who identify as men, who have data has shown ever since the very first global burden of disease exercise was undertaken in at the late 1980s, early 1990s. It's been very clear that men have a greater risk of premature mortality, whilst women live with a greater burden of disease. And if you think about that in its kind of logical conclusion, the longer women live, the more likely they are to be living with chronic diseases. And that's exactly what we see in this pattern of burden of disease. But you would see something very similar if I was to show you a graph that was split by premature mortality rather than burden of disease. If I could go to the next slide, please. This data is also from IHME, and it shows that if you do a deep dive into the IHME data, you can find out how these burdens are split by age group as well as by sex. You can look across all significant causes of both DALYs and burden of disease, premature mortality. The one thing that I think it's really important to be aware of with these kinds of data sets is that what we are generally lacking is sex disaggregated data on the use of health services. So the organisation I work for, we have been trying to look for sex disaggregated data on access to healthcare services, on who gets treatment and who has their disease controlled. And for the top 20 causes of premature mortality, we can actually only find that data for 3 conditions. That's HIV, diabetes, and hypertension. So whilst we know a lot, as Thomas has shown us, about causes of death, about causes of morbidity and mortality, we know very little from a sex disaggregated perspective about who actually gets access to health services. From as you heard in the introduction, I'm actually a professor of public health rather than health systems, and I would argue, and the evidence shows, that whilst it's important to know about access to health services, evidence over most studies that have looked at this show that health services actually only contribute about 30% to improvements in population health levels. So the bigger contributors, as you're about to see in the next slide, please, are actually the environments in which people live and die. So if we when we think about what contributes to the health outcomes of girls and women, most of the conceptual frameworks, most of the evidence relies on looking at health systems, relies on looking at data that's disaggregated by sex and age, and relies, as Pascal has mentioned, looking at the very important issue of gender norms that influence health beliefs and practices, both at the level of individuals and at the level of systems and structures. Next slide, please. If we take a more social and structural determinants approach to understanding what's actually influencing the intersection between SDG 3 and SDG 5, we very quickly understand that actually it's the entire panoply of all SDGs that are influencing health outcomes. And there's a very good literature on the intersection between the SDG, various SDG components, whether it's education or decent work or migration patterns and health outcomes, including in some cases data that is or evidence that is sex disaggregated. If I could go to the next slide, please. But as part of the work of the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health, what we've been trying to investigate is the bigger picture within which SDGs are actually operating. You know, as I'm sure you're all aware, one of the critiques of the SDGs is that they don't address the underlying structural normative influences, the political economy influences, for example, the value influences across societies that from the perspective of the Lancet Commission are actually the bigger drivers of how we think about delivering systems and structures and services. So what we've identified as part of the work of the Lancet Commission is the importance of neoliberalism. You've seen, for example, that there's this huge in non-communicable diseases. You know, the biggest single thing that we as a health community could do to improve health worldwide is to raise tobacco taxes. So, but regulatory power to do that, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or improving, reducing air pollution from fossil fuel burning, the ability of any of us to be able to do that is very much diminished in a neoliberal economy where the regulation of the private sector is something that challenges us all. We see the ongoing impact of capitalism on the health of women and girls. If we think about the health of women in relation to the unpaid care economy, for example, the fact that women are providing most of the social and domestic care responsibilities, as well as entering into the workforce in increasing numbers. We look at the corporate capture of women's health. None of us can have failed to notice the inexorable rise of femtech over the past couple of years. And we look at the history of colonialism with its structure of very gender unequal health systems, with men at the top generally as doctors, women lower down the hierarchy, often as nurses, and the ongoing impacts of imperialism, where agendas are set very far from communities. Communities have a deficit in their ability to actually decide their own health priorities. And surrounding all of this, we look at very much at the current, but also past and undoubtedly future impact that shifting social values have on our ability to address particularly gender inequality in an era of anti-gender oppositions, nationalist backlashes, and a huge rise in misogyny, particularly online misogyny through social media. So if I could come to the final slide, please. We do, however, identify some opportunities that we should be working on and thinking about how we address some of those big picture shifts in the political economy, in the social values. And one is the possibility of increased social movements, for the progressive social movements for social good through increased connectivity. You know, if we can make online spaces safer space for women and girls, we see a lot of examples where that leads to positive change. We are seeing an increase in financial resources, particularly through feminist philanthropy, which we should all be encouraging. We see increased opportunities for collecting disaggregated and intersectional data with the rise in digital technologies, although we think that, you know, it's still remarkably underutilized in the public sector, and most of that data is currently captured in the private sector. And despite my earlier hesitation about femtech, the one really important thing to realize about it, or to remember about it, is that it is about women-controlled health technologies. I do have a final slide about accountability mechanisms, which I would be grateful if it could be put up just for 10 seconds, which is to say that everybody calls for accountability. There are existing accountability mechanisms in place, as you all are fully aware of. But in our deep dive review of accountability mechanisms, what we very much saw was a lack of integration of health and gender accountability mechanisms. And we call for better moving SDG 3 accountability and SDG 5 accountability out of their silos and combining them as much as possible, so that we have a much better understanding of accountability for the health of all people of all gender identities. Thank you.